Hello, everybody. It's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Monday, the 4th of October. Click on the notification bell in the upper right to be notified when future episodes come out, and also the subscribe icon down here in the lower right to subscribe to future episodes. Today, I'm going to read an article written by Bo Traywick, who is a friend of mine. He's also a graduate of the VMI and also served in the Army during the Vietnam War. And with respect to the VMI, he was at one point on their board of visitors. This is an article he wrote called Our Marxist Revolution. Thomas Carlyle said that it takes men of worth to recognize the worth in men. Among the many worthy men who recognized the worth of General Robert E. Lee was the savior of Western civilization. Sir Winston Churchill said Lee was one of the noblest Americans who ever lived and one of the greatest captains in the annals of war. But now the Lee Monument in Richmond has been taken down. Our groveling scallywag governor says Lee no longer represents the values of Virginia. And judging from the filthy graffiti that has desecrated the Lee Monument ever since the rioting last summer, I would say no truer words have ever been spoken. We are in a Marxist revolution. Critical race theory merely replaces traditional class warfare with race warfare, with white people, and particularly Southern white people, as the so-called aggressors, oppressors, that is, and the conveniently long-dead Confederacy, the scapegoat for all the racial ills in the country. Ever since the spring of 1864, we Southerners have been on the defensive. No war was ever won on the defensive, but we have spent barrels of ink explaining the righteousness of our cause of our forefathers that our forefathers fought and died for, mistakenly confounding the many causes of secession with the single cause of war, which was secession itself. That is what the war was about. And what were fighting for was the defense of our land from invasion, conquest, and coerced political allegiance, just as in 1776, when the 13 slaveholding colonies seceded from the British Empire. But rather than taking the offensive and hammering our detractors with this simple truth, we instead get ourselves into involved defensive explanations that cause their eyes to glaze over and then calmly look at us and say slavery or racism or white supremacy. Now, I take a different approach. I indict the hypocrisy of our detractors and their myth of American history. The agitation over our Confederate monuments rests upon this fossilized myth, which proclaims that the Civil War was all about slavery. The righteous North waged it to free the slaves, and the evil South fought to keep them. End of story. Any questions? Well, yes. I don't buy into their myth. To think that the South went to war to keep their slaves, one must think that the North went to war to free them. The simple fact is that it did not. Aside from the obvious fact of Lincoln's bold disclaimer in his first inaugural at the outset of the war, if the North were waging a war on slavery, why didn't she free her own slaves? The simple fact that slavery was constitutional in the United States throughout the entire war is one of the most glaring omissions of historical fact buried under a colossal lie known as the myth of American history. Do the grammar school histories indoctrinate our children, or the Marxist professors of our highest universities of learning say anything about the self-righteous North's errant hypocrisy? When the various northern states abolished slavery for its inutility in their industrialized society, they did not free their slaves. They sold them south before the respective abolition laws went into effect. So if the righteous North went to war to free Southern slaves, why didn't the righteous Northerners first clean up their own backyards and free the rest of their own slaves? And why did Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued halfway through the war when the South was winning, say that slavery was all right as long as one were loyal to the US government? And why did he admit West Virginia, a so-called slave state, into the Union 6 months later? And why did he, a documented white supremacist, choose to inaugurate the bloodiest war in the history of the Western Hemisphere to, in effect, drive Southern slavery back into the Union. In his second inaugural, he claimed that the South was fighting to expand slavery into the territories, but the South was out of the Union. The Confederacy had already given up all its claims to all of the United States territories, making Lincoln's spacious claim just another smelly red herring to cover the tracks of his murderous usurpation of power and waging war against the secession of the Southern states. Since Lincoln did not recognize the Southern states as being out of the Union, by his own definition, he was committing treason under Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution by waging war against them. Secession is merely freedom of association writ large. There were many causes of secession, but not least of which, that Southerners no longer wished to be associated with those people who slandered and despised them so. But that begs the question of why those people waged the bloodiest war in the history of the Western Hemisphere to prevent their departure. To hear their vitriol, one would think that they would have been happy to rid the Southern apostates polluting what the New England Pilgrim Fathers called their city upon a hill. But they weren't for running the river. But they weren't for running like a river beneath their bigoted pieties was their avariciousness. In the South Cotton Kingdom with the South Cotton Kingdom out of the Union and set up as a free trade confederacy on the North's doorstep, the North's mercantile kingdom would have collapsed. So Lincoln rebuffed every Southern overture for peace and launched an armada against Charleston Harbor to provoke South Carolina into firing the first shot. South Carolina responded to Lincoln's provocation at Charleston, just as Massachusetts had responded to George III's provocation at Lexington and Concord, giving Lincoln the war he wanted, but putting himself in the shoes of George III. Virginia, the mother of states and of statesmen, stood solidly for the Union she had done so much to create, but when Lincoln called for her troops to subjugate the Cotton States, Virginia refused, indicted Lincoln for choosing to inaugurate civil war, seceded from the Union, and joined the Confederacy. 4 other states, including occupied Missouri, followed her out. But after 4 years of arduous service, as General Lee said at Appomattox, the South was compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources, and Lincoln drove the Southern states back into the Union at the point of the bayonet. Although John Wilkes Booth made a martyr out of America's Caesar, Reconstruction cemented his conquest. With an army of occupation, in the pretense of law, and with the Union League stirring up racial hatred, a corrupt Northern political party transformed the voluntary Union of Southern states into a coerced Yankee empire, pinned together with bayonets. With her men killed and her land waste, the South, at the behest of General Lee, accepted the situation. In good faith, she sent her representatives to the U.S. Congress in December 1865, but the radicals in control, and they were, but the radicals were in control, and they were not allowed to take their seats. Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania stated the radical opinion, quote, "The future condition of the conquered power depends upon the will of the conqueror. They must come in as new states or remain as conquered provinces. Congress is the only power that can act in this manner. Congress must create states and declare when they are entitled to be represented. And there are no symptoms that the people of those provinces will be prepared to participate in constitutional government for some years. I know of no arrangement so proper for them as territorial governments. There they can learn the principles of freedom and eat the fruit of foul rebellion." In that session, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the United States was sent to the states and was ratified 3 years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The 14th Amendment was then proposed. This would give illiterate blacks the right to vote and serve on juries. It barred all ex-Confederates from federal and state offices, and it required the Southern states to share in the payment of Union war debt and to repudiate their own debt. Tennessee ratified, but the 10 ex-Confederate states that rejected it lost their identities in March of 1867 with the passage by Congress of the first Reconstruction Act. That act divided the 10 southern states into 5 military districts, with Virginia being designated military district number 1. It stipulated that each southern state frame a new constitution that met the Yankee approval. This was to be done by a convention consisting of male delegates of whatever race, color, or previous condition, with the exception of all Confederate soldiers and most Southern white people, all of whom were disfranchised. Then, when the legislature elected under this Constitution had ratified the proposed 14th Amendment, the state would be declared entitled to representation in Congress, or in other words, readmitted into the Union. Now, it might be asked that if these states were considered out of the Union under the Reconstruction Act and therefore under military law, how could they ratify an amendment to the Constitution of a Union that they were not in? And if they had never been recognized as being out of the Union, how could they be compelled to ratify it? The answer, of course, is federal bayonets. Reconstruction was nothing short of a revolution on the same order as the Bolshevik revolution in 1917. Results: for the North, the Gilded Age; for the South, grinding poverty in a land laid waste until the Second World War, and the curse of being ruled by little men. For the Blacks, a recent study of military and Freedmen's Bureau records has revealed that between 1862 and 1870, perhaps as many as 1 million ex-slaves, or 25% of its population, died of starvation, disease, and neglect under their northern, quote, liberators. Freed from their master's care, Father Abraham, the great emancipator, had told them to, quote, root hog or die, close quote. Black enfranchisement in the South and disfranchisement of Southern rights were merely cyclical Northern political tools to cement the North's conquest. And once she had achieved it with her so-called Reconstruction, the North abandoned her black puppets, or useful idiots, as the communists Vladimir Lenin would have called them, to the upheaval she had wrought in the Southern society, and turned her attention to the Plains Indians, who were in the way of her transcontinental railroads. But that's another story. Let the Indians tell you that one. The gradual peace and reconciliation after Reconstruction came in part from the South's acceptance of the situation, and in part from the North's recognition of the South's difficulty in suddenly assimilating millions of Africans into a European population that had been steeped in Western civilization for thousands of years. As such, since the North had gotten what she wanted out of the war and Reconstruction, which was control of the federal government and its finances, she was content to let the South deal with their own domestic problems in peace. However, when hopeful Southern Blacks started moving north to the Promised Land in the Great Migration, they found themselves relegated by a cold Northern racism into segregated ghettos, and discovered that the Northern rhetoric about social equality was a political sham. And the invention of television gave Northern politicians and demagogues a way out of this embarrassing situation by giving them the means to divert Black attention from de facto Northern segregation onto the codified segregation in the South. But their demagoguery provoked racial agitation that broke into urban race riots up north. Desperate, guilt-ridden Northern white liberals were driven to devise further crusades upon which to divert attention from their credulous and unwanted Black population onto Southern scapegoats. First came the self-righteous freedom riders protesting Southern segregation, locked arm in arm with Black protest marchers, and posting their progressive virtues before the TV cameras for all to see. But while they were delivering tutorials on proper race relations to the benighted Southerners, the Blacks up north were burning their cities down. And they have been doing it ever since, forever compelling desperate white liberals to devise new crusades upon which to post their virtues. Their latest crusade is against Confederate monuments, but when all of the Confederate monuments have been vandalized and torn down, Who will be their next targets? Be assured that these self-righteous Latter-day Puritans will not rest for crusading. Witch burning and virtue posting is in their DNA. It came over in the Mayflower. Meanwhile, Monument Avenue in Richmond is a desecrated and vandalized shambles. Thomas Jefferson is under assault. Washington Lee has repudiated General Lee, or nearly so. And VMI has repudiated Stonewall Jackson's, where her cadets who fought and died at the Battle of Newmarket are buried on a post under Sir Moses Ezekiel's, quote, Virginia mourning her dead, close quote, statue. And they have become, which has become an embarrassment to the VMI and a rebuke. As the mania of identity politics and racial equity for every conceivable definition of race, gender, and species reaches the point of absurdity in the Victimhood Olympics, we have been carried away into Babylon, with women being sent into combat while men push baby buggies around town, with girls becoming Boy Scouts and men choosing to be women, with children deciding their gender and being given access to the bathroom of their choice in school, with anarchy ruling the classrooms and teachers being assaulted by their students, with history being taught as Marxist indoctrination and critical race theory, with conservative speakers at colleges being hounded off campus by Antifa and Black Lives Matter mobs, with affirmative action and race norming instead of merit and SAT scores determining college admissions, with laws being made to conform to barbaric behavior instead of barbaric behavior being made to conform to laws, with convicts being released to create racial parity in the prisons, with the national debt approaching an unimaginable $30 trillion, with the US government printing money and running riot with it like teenagers possessing a bottle of whiskey and their daddy's car keys, while the homeless wander the streets and beg on every corner as the third world pours in across our open borders, and on and on and on. As one commentator said recently, we have become so open-minded that our brains have fallen out. Do not hope to reason with these people, for trying to reason with them is like singing hymns to a fence post with the boombox perched on top of it, blasting gutter grunts from some hip-hop rapper. I know whereof I speak, for I was once a Virginia flagger on the sidewalk before the VMFA and faced these mobs. These are the same people who spat on us at the airport when we returned from Vietnam. So I quit before prison would become my portion, but not before I had gotten one protester arrested and convicted for curse and abuse. If Reconstruction was calculated like the communist Bolshevik revolution in 1917, today's woke revolution is fanatically mindless like the French Revolution and its bloody reign of terror. I am waiting for the Confederate monuments to be replaced with the guillotine. Progressives consider the march of history to be a linear march toward a secular utopia perfection, where the oppressive laws of God have been repealed. It began with the New England Puritans. While Southerners were following Daniel Boone through the Cumberland Gap, these Yankee utopians were burning witches in John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill. And while Southerners were 500 miles west of the Mississippi in Texas defending the Alamo, these Yankee utopians were 100 miles west of the Hudson River in New York, establishing their collectivist free love communes and setting themselves up as a standard by which all true Americans should be measured. In this, they have been remarkably successful, to a point where today they have inmates running the equality asylum. But as the preacher says in the book of Ecclesiastes, consider the works of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? The righteous progressives and their social justice warriors love to claim that they are on the right side of history, but Southerners know that history is not a linear march that will end in a rosy utopia, but a cyclical march of folly, where rosy utopian dreams end in totalitarian nightmares. Thus, Southerners are and always have been apostates in this brave new world where, quote, all men are paid for existing and no man must pay for his sins, close quote, as Kipling put it. Southern monuments speak truth to this power with disdain and stand as an indictment and a rebuke against the leveling mediocrity of these times. Lee, Jackson, and Stuart were heroes of the classical mode of Hector, breaker of horses under the walls of windy Troy, or the fierce Achilles, or the brave Odysseus, or the dauntless Aeneas. No wonder the heathen rage at our Confederate monuments, for these little men who swarm about in this age without a name are shamed by them. As Tennyson wrote, yea, they would pare the mountain to the plain and leave an equal baseness. The Reverend Robert Louis Dabney, one-time chief of staff to Stonewall Jackson, who wrote that Southerners know in due time they will be avenged through these same disorganizing heresies, which will redound upon the North. And we, not seeing it now, with the godless anarchy that radicals have wrought, and with their blasphemous demands for equity to, quote, correct the works of God. That's a question mark. In classical Greek mythology, Icarus, in his hubris, flew too close to the sun, but Nemesis brought him down. The social justice warriors, with their woke revolution and their equity, their mob rule, and most of all, with their hubris, forget that man is merely the master and not the creator of the world. So let these arrogant and successful wrongdoers flout their disdain for our Confederate monuments and all they stand for. As Dr. Dabney said, we will meet them with it again when it will be heard in the day of their calamity, the pages of impartial history, and in the day of judgment. Meanwhile, keep your powder dry, and when they come to your door to take you away in the tumbrel to the guillotine, let them be in for a surprise. Okay, that is Bo Traywick's article, The Marxist Revolution. And I'm going to provide a link to it below here. And so with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.